Hi everyone, and welcome. The lesson you're about to see is about fractions. Basically, the deal is, a lot of students complain to me in an algebra class that they've forgotten how to deal with fractions, and you sort of need to know that before you enter an algebra class. So in case that's you, and you're already in the algebra class and you need to learn how to do fractions, that's what this video is for, kind of a refresher. So what we're going to cover in this video is how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions. Those are the main things you need to know how to do. Before we can do that though, there's one little topic we have to talk about first, and then it'll make adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing a lot easier. The topic we have to talk about is how to transform fractions. So let's get started talking about that. Okay, here's the deal. Before fractions were invented, if you had to write down a number, there was only one way to write it. Like if I said write down the number 2, okay, there's only one way to do it. The problem is with fractions is there's lots of ways to write the same number. For example, if I want to write the fraction 1/2, there are lots of different fractions that look different, but they're all the same number, they all mean 1/2. For example, if we look at the number 1/2, writing like that, 1 divided by 2, that fraction is the same fraction as 3/6. Let's say, and that's also the same fraction as, 10 over 20. So all these fractions, they look different, and that's the point. They all look different because the numbers on top are all different, so they look different, but they represent the same number. So there are two main things that we can do to fractions and get another fraction that's exactly the same number. We can take the top and bottom of the fraction and divide the top and bottom numbers by the same number. That's usually called simplifying, and that's one of the things we can do to get a new fraction that's the same as the old one, except the advantage is that the numbers are smaller and people like smaller numbers because it's simpler. So let's look at this example. Okay, so let's look at the fraction 9 over 15. So a question might be to simplify this fraction. And what that means is we'd like to make the numbers on the top and on the bottom smaller if we could, but have it still be the same fraction. To do that, what we can do is we can look for a number that we can divide the 9 by, see if we could divide the 15 by that same number, and then if you just divide both of them by that same number, you will get another fraction that looks different but is the same. If you look at it long enough, you will see that 3 goes into both of these. So what I can do is I can divide the 9 by 3, divide the 15 by 3, and if I divide the 9 by the 3, I get 3. If I divide the 15 by 3, I get 5. So, very important thing that I'm talking about here, the important thing is that if you have a fraction, if you want, you can divide the top and the bottom of the fraction by the same number. The number is not important. You can do any one you want as long as it gives you an answer that you like. But if you can divide the top and bottom fraction by anything you want, and then the new fraction you get is the same as the old fraction. So the point is that 9 over 15 and 3 over 5 are the same number. They're the same fraction, even though they look different. Let's try one more example. Okay, let's look at the fraction 4 over 14. Again, it's perfectly fine as it is, but let's try to simplify it, meaning I am going to see if I can divide the top number, in the case the 4, divide that by something, divide the 14 by the same thing. So we're looking for something that goes into both of them evenly. And if we could find that thing, we'll divide both of them by that, and we'll get a new fraction with the numbers being smaller, and that will be a simpler fraction. In this case, you can see that 2 goes into both of these, so I could take the 4 and divide it by 2, and the 14 and also divide it by 2. And when I do that, 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 14 divided by 2 is 7. And the point of this is that 4 over 14 is the same fraction as 2 over 7. These two fractions are the same. So that's one thing you could do with fractions. You could divide the top and bottom of the fraction by the same number and get the same fraction with different numbers. Okay, so again, they look different. The numbers are different, but the number itself, the 4 over 14 as a whole and the 2 over 7 as a whole, are the same number. Now here's another thing you could do with fractions. You could take the top and bottom of a fraction and multiply the top and the bottom by the same number. For example, if I give you a fraction, you could, if you wanted to, multiply the top of it by 5 and the bottom of it also by 5. And if you did that, the new fraction that you would get, again, would be the same as the old one. Now, of course, there's a question, why would I ever want to do that? Okay, so it seems a little weird, but let me just tell you in advance that the reason is because that's going to help us when we come to adding fractions. You would never really get a question like that on its own. You might get a question like simplify a fraction, and then you divide the top and bottom by the same number. But usually you don't get a question that says, oh, I don't like the numbers in this fraction, let's make them bigger somehow. Okay, so you might not actually get a question by itself like that. But again, remember, what I'm teaching you right now is going to help us when we're adding and subtracting fractions. So for now, just believe that we want to do it. Okay, so let's look at these examples. Again, before we look at the examples, let me just say real quick, remember the thing that we're learning here is you could take a fraction and you can multiply the top and the bottom by anything you want, as long as you multiply by the same thing. And you will get another fraction that's the same as the original one. So they're the same. Again, what I mean by the same is it represents the same number, but it looks different. Okay, let's try this example. Okay, let's look at the fraction 3 over 8. I'm going to write down the question here. Okay, let's say the question asks you to write, so we want to write an equivalent fraction so another fraction that's equal to this one, but with a different denominator, denominator of course meaning the bottom number. Let's say I don't like the 8. For some reason I want the denominator to be 24. Okay, so again, remembering the rule that I just talked about, that if you wanted to, you could multiply the top and the bottom of the fraction by the same number, and when you do that, you get a new fraction that looks different but is the same number. So if I wanted the denominator to be 24 instead of 8, I could multiply the denominator by 3. If I multiply the 8 by 3, I will get 24. But remember, in order to get the same fraction when I'm done, I have to do the same thing to the top and to the bottom. So what I will do is I will multiply the top of this fraction by 3 and the bottom of this fraction by 3. When I do that, 3 times 3 is 9, that's the top, and 8 times 3 is 24, that's the bottom. And now I know that 3 over 8, that number, is the same number as 9 over 24. And all I accomplished really is I changed the denominator. Again, it seems a little silly. Why would we want the numbers in our fraction to be bigger? Again, please believe that we'll need that later when we talk about how to add fractions. Right now, all I can say is there's basically two things that we've talked about. The two things we've talked about are, if you have a fraction, if you want, you can divide the top and bottom by the same number and you get the same fraction. You can also multiply the top and bottom of a fraction by the same number and you'll get a new fraction that's equivalent to the old one. Notice what I did not say. I did not say that you can add the same number to the top and bottom. You cannot subtract the same number from the top and the bottom. Okay, so the rules are, if you want to change your fraction to a different fraction, there's only two things you can do. You can either divide the top and the bottom by the same number or multiply the top and the bottom by the same number. Okay, and again, the advantage of dividing is you make your numbers smaller, and usually you want to write your answer with the smallest possible numbers so that it's as simple as possible. So someone might say simplify a fraction. You would start trying to divide the top and bottom by something and make the numbers smaller. And again, if for some reason you don't like the denominator of your fraction, then if you wanted to change it, you could possibly multiply the top and the bottom by some number and change the denominator. Just like we did in this case where we changed a fraction with denominator 8 to the same number, but so it's the same fraction, it looks different, with a different denominator. The denominator is 24. Okay, now let's get on to the point of the video. Remember, the point of the video is to do four things. I want to teach you how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions. When I was in high school, I had a real hard time remembering how to do these things because it was like, oh, sometimes you had to do something, some rule, and then sometimes you had to do some other rule. So the way I'm going to teach it to you right now is this. Just remember that multiplying fractions is the easy one to do. That really is what helped me when I was learning how to do this. Remember, multiplying is easy and dividing is easy, and then adding and subtracting are harder. Okay, so let's start off with easy stuff. Let's start multiplying fractions.